It is a world that still needs multilateralism, that still needs that level playing field. But the original supporters of that multilateral system are beginning to question whether that system works for them now.
Hello, this is the Weekly Tradecast, a podcast brought to you by UN Trade and Development. I'm Sarah Toms. We're exploring how major events are shaping trade and development and how that affects billions of people around the world. With the annual meetings of the World Bank and International Monetary Fund happening this month, we're looking at Bretton Woods, its 80-year legacy, and how the global financial system could better support development. The Bretton Woods Agreement of July 1944, about a year before the end of World War II, aimed to create an efficient foreign exchange system and promote trade and economic growth. All of the countries in the system agreed to a fixed peg of their currencies against the US dollar, which in turn was pegged to the price of gold. The currency peg and the system collapsed in the early 1970s, but out of the Bretton Woods system came various multilateral organisations that remain as fixtures of trade, development, and the global financial architecture. Today, there are calls for new approaches as climate change threatens the planet, a series of crises hit the global economy, and many countries suffer from debt distress that is stunting their growth. For more, I'm joined now by special guest Danny Quah to explore the legacy of Bretton Woods and reforms to the global financial system. At the National University of Singapore, Danny is the Dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy and the Lee Ka-shing Professor in Economics. The views in this interview are those of the guest. Well, thank you, Danny, so much for joining us. It's lovely to speak to you. So to start off, the Bretton Woods system emerged 80 years ago, and it was during a very difficult era. Looking back, why did the system come into being? How did it work? And why did it fail?
Thank you for allowing me to be here. 80 years ago, the world was obviously vastly different. For the purposes of discussing the Bretton Woods institutions, most of the world was in ruins. Countries had fought a terrible war. Cities, towns, countryside had been devastated. Production centers were devoted to something completely unsuited for peacetime activity, and countries were bankrupt. They were debt-ridden. So 8 decades ago, we needed a system that would both bootstrap these very poor countries, which was basically the entire world, out of the situation they were in, into a virtuous cycle of productive activity. And we needed a level playing field that they could then participate in going forwards. There was only one country that had the resources to do this. This was the country that had won the World War. This was the country that owned 70% of the world's gold reserves. This was the country to which most of the world owed significant debt. So then the question was, how would the United States allow the global economy to grow from that really quite desperate state? The United States proposed reconstruction. Now, all of that required a structure. The countries on the winning side had gotten together at Bretton Woods to hammer out what those institutions would look like. The two institutions that emerged were the IMF and what would become the World Bank. The World Bank was charged with financing economic development, undertaking the kind of investment that would be required for the world to once again develop its productive capacities. The other institution, the IMF, was set to be the one that built a level playing field, where countries, through organizing their currency arrangements, did not unfairly try and take advantage of yet other nations. So there was not going to be competitive devaluation, a system of fixed exchange rates, but that were changeable under certain circumstances, what was put in place. The IMF stood ready to step in if there were short-term balance of payments deficit problems. But most of all, it was mostly a referee that allowed this level playing field to operate. It was in the interest of the United States to run such institutions, because by doing this, they helped the rest of the world developing and growing, allowed them to pay their debts to the United States. It allowed them to increase their productive capacity and their incomes, that they would then buy goods and services from the United States. And this was a system that worked wonderfully for the first several decades. And in the early 1970s, the weaknesses of the system had begun to manifest, and that system of fixed exchange rates broke down. And from out of that, there grew a system of greater and greater flexibility in currency arrangements. But the IMF and the World Bank evolved and adapted in this new world. What did not change in all of this was the firm commitment to the idea that you needed to construct a level playing field, that multilateralism was the way in which you allowed the global economy to continue to prosper, to help ordinary people improve their standards of living. And it worked very well. But then more recently, of course, there have once again been calls to change this system. Today, there are still problems of foreign debt overhang. But today, when we look out in the international landscape, it is not a world where cities, towns, and countryside have been devastated. It is a very different kind of world. It is a world that still needs multilateralism, that still needs that level playing field. But the original referees, the original supporters of that multilateral system are beginning to question whether that system works for them now. For a long time, in decades past, the objection came from emerging countries that felt that even though there was a multilateral system put in place, there was supposed to be a level playing field, countries ran into foreign debt challenges. There were issues about whether the decision-making power was sufficiently distributed in a way that reflected economic realities. There were countries that had grown to be much more powerful and felt that they did not have enough say in the international system. And so the rebalancing that's needed is one that's much more complicated, I think, than what it was in decades past.
Do you think these multilateral institutions are actually giving developing countries enough support, or the support they need?
I think the developing countries will always need support, the same way that within most countries, the weak and vulnerable within all our societies need support. But more than anything else, what the developing countries want is simply a fair shot. They simply want a set of rules that are understandable, that don't disadvantage them, a set of rules that allow them to play at their best level, that do not discriminate against them. They want the multilateral international trading system. They want every now and then special and differentiated treatment because of specific circumstances. But in the main, once they get past that, basically they want to trade.
There are calls, as you said, for reform. So what is being proposed? And is it a matter of making a few fixes, or is it a question of a fundamental overhaul?
Every large financial institution is aware of the challenge of the global climate crisis, is aware of the needs, the urgent needs of energy transition towards renewables and clean and green. Every nation is aware of the need to build resilience against the next pandemic. And we have, all of us, adjusted our modes of operation towards that. That's to everyone's credit. So those who continue to say the great institutions are inflexible really do need to examine how these institutions have changed so much. Where they haven't changed is the distribution of power across the different economies, across the different nations, and the way in which the rules of the game are written, and the way in which great powers continue to be allowed to break the rules with neither apology nor permission being asked. Great powers are allowed to do that. every now and then. But if they make it a practice, then the entire system, that comes under attack. It comes under attack internally, introduces great uncertainty into the system, and everyone is at a loss how to proceed. So the great tension, I feel, is that, we've moved away from where it's the poorer, small countries complaining about how, the great institutions discriminate against them, don't give them enough room to grow. I think all of that, while there is still a lot of discussion narrative around that needs to be put in perspective against the great geopolitical rivalry of our time, which is clamping down on the performance of the rules-based order and on the world being able to innovate better for the great urgent needs that we are faced with.
What combination of changes would actually deliver the best results then to actually better support development and the green transition?
So here's a very crass example. The whole world is up in arms about how the great powers are subsidizing different industries. This is terrible. The third nations of the world, we're much smaller. We don't have the fiscal space to play that same game. I say, let's relax about this. What are the great powers seeking to subsidize? If they're subsidizing consumption, production, use of renewable energy, I say let every great power practice industrial policy in that regard. By doing that, they push the frontier of renewable energy. All the rest of the world, the third nations, benefit from greater availability, greater diversity, lower prices, more affordability, better technology in renewables. We have allowed inadvertent cooperation to emerge out of great power confrontation. We should be mindful of opportunities like that. It is up to the small nations, the third nations, those of us who are not involved in the front line of this great geopolitical confrontation, to be imaginative and creative in how we imagine situations for inadvertent cooperation. We need a kind of multilateralism that still appeals to what we might think of as coalitions of the willing, those who continue to subscribe to the principles of multilateralism that work for them, that where they are allowed to inadvertently cooperate with others. I'm not talking about regionalism. I'm talking about groups of countries that can come together, agree upon a restricted or pathfinder set of rules that then allow them to build a level playing field where they can engage with one another in trade and foreign investment.
So obviously there are a lot of multilateral organizations, regional banks, but in today's fragmented world, how realistic is it that actually these reforms will be realized?
You've asked really the most difficult question. Now, my thinking is always we've got to align the incentives. We've got to make it so that everybody who's involved in the reform sees a little bit of gain to themselves. Otherwise, we're dead in the water. There are people who say, well, as long as we get enough of a majority moving in the right direction, then the reform will happen. Well, not guaranteed, because the world remains an unequal place. There's no guarantee that simply by being demonstrably better, that will actually happen. Somebody else we need to excite to come along with us on this journey. We've got to come up with concrete action plans that help move these people along the pathway that is truly win-win. And if part of that means that in the trade deals we craft, the country that more clearly gains is convinced to share some of those gains so that we can bring along the unemployed steel workers, the unemployed farmers, we would once again put trade in a win-win-win proposition for everyone.
Thank you so much to Danny Quah from the National University of Singapore, who was this week's guest. Tune into the Weekly Tradecast next week and every week for more insights on the most pressing issues around the world of trade and development. And there's even more on our website, unctad.org. I'm Sarah Toms in Geneva. Goodbye for now.